I'm Reverend Lance from the First Congregational United Church of Christ in Alpena, Michigan. In my sermon on June 21st, I mentioned a delightful little book called Who Moved My Cheese by Dr. Spencer Johnson. And I said that I would say something more about it, but I realized it would have taken up the whole 20 minutes of my sermon to tell the story. So I asked you to come back today and hear a few more comments. Dr. Spencer Johnson's book outlines healthy approaches to change by telling an extended parable in which two mice and two little people search for and find cheese. Now talk about something mundane. I mean, here we are facing rioting in the streets, shortages of meat, potential widespread COVID-19 contagion, a cantankerous election, and Reverend Lance, you're going to talk to us about cheese? Now, cheese is a metaphor for what we want to have in life. Whether it's a job, a relationship, more money, a big house, freedom, health, recognition, spiritual peace, anything we're willing to search and strive after. Dr. Johnson says each one of us has our own idea of what cheese is. And he says we pursue it because we believe it's the thing that'll make us happy. If we can get it, we often become attached to it. And if we lose it or it's taken away, that can be traumatic. So I ask you to indulge me for the next few minutes as we imagine together the story of the two mice and the two little men who search for their cheese through the maze of their lives. And Dr. Johnson explains that the maze in the story represents where you spend your time, where it is that you're looking for what you want. It could be the organization you work in, the community that you live in, or the relationships you have in your life. One thing I would say here for our purposes is our congregation. And the dilemma that drives the story forward is apparent in the book's title. Who moved my cheese? The two mice are named Sniff and Scurry, and they tend to keep things simple. They sniff the air to locate the cheese, and then they scurry up and down the corridors of the maze until they find it. And when the cheese is moved, they notice the change. They promptly sniff and scurry their way through the maze until they find a new stash of different cheeses. Got it? The two little people, named Hem and Haw, have much more complex human brains, and their human emotions further complicate things. As you hear what the four characters do as they seek their cheese, you can decide which of their reactions best represents parts of you when you are faced with inevitable change. Sometimes it's to our advantage to do the simplest things, but quite often we don't do the most natural, the simplest. As different as mice and little people are in real life, in the story they shared some things in common. Every morning, they would put on their jogging suits and their running shoes. They would leave their little homes. They would race out through the maze looking for their favorite cheese. It was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, some of which contained pockets of delicious cheese. But there were also some dark corners. There were some blind alleys that seemed to lead nowhere. It was easy to get lost. But for those who found their way, the maze held secrets that let them enjoy a better life than they would have had just sitting at home. Well, to make the long story short, the mice, Sniff and Scurry, used the simple trial and error method of finding cheese. They ran down one corridor, and if it proved to be empty, well, they turned and they ran down another. The two mice remembered which corridors had no cheese, and they quickly went to explore new areas. Sniff would smell out the general direction using his great nose, and Scurry would race ahead, sometimes going in the wrong direction, sometimes bumping into walls, but after a while they found their way, and at the end of the day they had their cheese. Now Hem and Haw, the two little people, using more sophisticated methods, their ability to think, for example, But it was also clouded occasionally with emotions that took over and made the maze all that more challenging. But they eventually found their cheese. And every morning after that, the mice and the little people would dress in their running gear. They would head over to where they now knew the cheese was to be found, because it had been there the day before. When they arrived, they took their running shoes off and they enjoyed their cheese. But after a while, a little different routine set in for the two little people. Each day, Hem and Haw would wake up a little bit later, they would dress a little slower, and they would walk to their cheese. After all, they now knew where it was and how to get there. They had no idea where the cheese came from or who put it there. They just assumed it would always be there, new every morning. So they settled in. They made themselves at home, put away their jogging suits, and put on their slippers. They were becoming very comfortable with the routine. In time, they moved their houses closer to where the cheese was. They built their social life around it. And they decorated the walls with sayings such as, "Having cheese makes you happy," and "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Well, one morning, when Sniff and Scurry arrived at the cheese station, they discovered there was no cheese. They weren't really surprised because they'd noticed that the supply had been getting smaller every day when they arrived, and so they were prepared for the inevitable. They knew instinctively what to do. Instead of taking off their running shoes, they laced them a bit tighter, they looked out into the maze, and with a sniff, went off in search of new cheese. Later that day, when Hem and Haw arrived at the cheese station, they were unprepared for what they saw. "What? No cheese?" Hem yelled, "There's no cheese!" He thought that if he yelled loud enough, somebody would hear and then put the cheese back where it belonged. "Who moved my cheese?" he hollered. Hands on his hips, face turning red, he said to his friend Haw, "It's not fair." Well, Haw just stood there frozen with shock. He was just not ready for this. Oh, no, 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 no. They had not been paying attention to the small changes that had been taking place every day, so they simply had taken it for granted their cheese would always be there. And Haw knew that Hem was yelling something, but he just didn't want to deal with it, so he just tuned everything out. It took a long time trying to decide what had happened. Who had moved the cheese? What to do about it? They kept looking around that now cheeseless cheese station to see if the cheese really was gone. While Sniff and Scurry had quickly moved on, Hem and Haw continued to, well, hem and haw. Hem ranted and raved about the injustice of it all, and he looked for somebody to blame. And Haw started to get depressed. They'd made future plans based on having an ample supply of this cheese. What would happen if it isn't there again tomorrow? I mean, no one had warned them. It wasn't right. This is not the way things are supposed to be. And they went home that night, hungry and angry and discouraged. But before they left, Haw wrote on the wall, "The more important your cheese is to you, the more you want to hold on to it." Yeah. The next day, Hem and Haw returned to the cheese station where they expected somehow to find their cheese again. But the situation hadn't changed. There was no cheese. Hem analyzed the situation in his human brain over and over, running the facts as he knew them, running them through his complicated belief systems. Why did they do this to us? He demanded. What's really going on? Who is behind this? Do you think Sniff and Scurry know something that we don't? Now Haw would shut his eyes and put his hands over his ears, just wanted to block everything out. He hoped that when he opened his eyes, that things would be back to normal, just like they used to be, when all was well, when things were comfortable. What would Sniff and Scurry know? He scoffed. They're just simple, stupid mice. Maybe they took our cheese, said Hem. Look, we didn't cause this problem. Somebody else did this, and we need to get to the bottom of it. Or maybe we should just stop analyzing the situation so much and just get going and find some new cheese. Haw suggested. No, I like it here, Hem replied. I'm getting too old for running through the maze like we used to do. I'm not interested in getting lost or making a fool of myself. Are you? And with that, Haw's fear of failing returned, and he agreed that going out in search of new cheese was not a good idea after all. They continued to come to the old cheese station every day, but with less and less enthusiasm as they suffered the effects of having no cheese. They had felt entitled to their cheese, and it hurt that somebody had moved it. They were frustrated with the changed situation, and they were becoming angry. They began blaming each other for the weakened condition that they found themselves in. And every night they returned home, carrying their worries and their frustrations with them and shaking their fingers and pointing their fingers. Meanwhile, over those days, while Hem and Haw were trying to decide what to do, waiting for their cheese to come back to them like it used to be, Sniff and Scurry had gone farther down the maze, up and down the corridors, looking for new cheese in places where they had never been before. And they squealed with delight when they found the biggest store of cheese the mice had ever seen. Unlike the old cheese, which was kind of processed Velveeta, the mice had found Swiss cheese with holes in it. And down other corridors, they came upon bright orange cheddar, Italian mozzarella and parmesan, and wonderfully creamy French camembert. Who would have known there were so many possibilities out there? Now, sure, they ran into a fair share of dead ends. They bumped into a few blind corners, but they also came across hard Dubliner cheese and some soft feta cheese. And once they found a whole round of Gouda cheese from Holland. The mice liked the way things had changed because it was for the good once they had let go of their old cheese station and moved on from it. Now, unfortunately, since their cheese had disappeared, Hem and Haw began to think there may not be any cheese in the maze anywhere. Peering anxiously down the maze in directions they had never gone, Haw was afraid that if he went out, he might not be able to find his way back. And Hem was worried that if any cheese did exist, they might not find it. I mean, these kinds of fears were immobilizing them. Now, if you want to hear the whole story, I really encourage you, buy the book, or you can borrow one of mine. I have a few copies I'd be happy to loan you. But the point is clear, and it's said on page 46. If you do not change, you can become extinct. As we reflect back on the plight of Hem and Haw, stuck in their old patterns of thinking, we might ask ourselves regarding the changes that we ourselves are facing, what would you do if you were not afraid? And even though we may not be sure of our way forward in this maze of life right now, since things are, as everyone says, unprecedented and uncertain in many ways, and it seems that progress always is measured by taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, there is something to be said about taking control rather than simply letting things happen to us. If Sniff and Scurry, a couple of mice, could move on, well, so can we. We may not be moving as fast as some other churches are doing by waiting until late July to reopen our public worship. But that's because we don't want to leave anyone behind, especially the most vulnerable people among us. Our slogan here is, whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And we can't be stopping half the people at the door saying, no, not you, not you. See, taking baby steps feels about right until we know how things will unfold as the summer begins. But unfortunately, in my opinion, the Alpena News has stopped publishing the numbers of virus tests that are given. Even though not yet even 800 people have been tested in Alpena, and our county has something like 23,000 people in it. We need to track the testing, at least until there are several thousands that know where they stand. And we need to track their contacts. Until there's a vaccine, that's the best that we can do. We can mask up, yes. We can wash our hands often. And we can keep 6 feet of physical distance between people. But we don't push the river. We don't open too soon. We don't leave anybody vulnerable behind. Well, in the story, the amount of cheese had been gradually getting smaller all along. It didn't just disappear overnight. And Dr. Johnson writes, the change probably would not have taken them by surprise if they had been watching what was happening all along and if they had anticipated the change. See, if we expect change to happen and look for it, we can trust our basic instincts to sense when change is going to occur, and we can be ready to adapt to it. While it may be natural for people to fear the unknown, to be anxious about the uncertainty of change, Dr. Johnson writes, and I quote, "Sometimes some fear can be good. When you're afraid things are going to get worse if you don't do something, it can prompt you to take action. But it is not good when you're so afraid that it keeps you from doing anything." By the time Hem and Haw journeyed out into the maze again, jogging slowly into the unknown, they were afraid that they'd waited too long. They hadn't had any cheese for so long, they were now weak. It took them longer. It was more painful than usual to get through the maze. And they decided that if they ever got the chance again, they would get out of their comfort zone sooner. They would adapt to the change more readily. It would make things easier. "Better late than never," said Haw, who had finally gotten over his denial. For his part, Hem had to let go of his anger and begin to trust what lay ahead for them. "When you move beyond your fear," Haw wrote on the wall, "you'll feel free." When you move beyond your fear, you'll feel free. They began to think about what they could gain from these changes instead of what they were losing in them. They began to think about what they were moving toward rather than what they were leaving behind. They realized change could lead to something better. If they had expected change rather than wasting time denying the changes that had already taken place, they could have gotten out of their old cheeseless state much sooner. "Old beliefs do not lead you to new cheese," Haw wrote on the wall. Noticing small changes early helps you adapt to the bigger changes that inevitably are coming. They realized that when they were afraid to change, they were holding on to the illusion of their old cheese station, which was no longer there. So what made them change? The fear of starving to death. Until there's a real sense of urgency, most folks refuse to change. We remain comfortable with the status quo, even when it's no longer working, because we feel no urgency to do things differently. Because to change requires using our energy and using it in new ways and trying stuff. The mice kept life simple. They didn't overanalyze. They didn't overcomplicate things. There was no paralysis of analysis with Sniff and Scurry. When the situation changed and the cheese had been moved, they changed and moved with it. This little story has made me more aware of the need to keep things simple, to be flexible, and to move more quickly. See, I personally have said for the past 7 years that I've been here as the minister that we need to take baby steps when we're changing things at the church. But now I've come to see that if we do not adapt in time, we might as well not adapt at all. The urgency to grow this congregation or to risk extinction of the congregational way in Alpena is only now beginning to come through to many of us. First Congregational was the first church in Alpena back in 1862. And we're still here. We're still flourishing. We're still rich with people and processes. We have a distinctive voice, and we have a perspective as the United Church, as a non-creedal, independent-minded church. And it's flourishing in spirit, but the numbers are declining. Now, I suspect it's my own comfort level with our more traditional style of worship. We have a robed choir, a sermon from a pulpit, songs from a hymnal. We have piano and organ music, and so forth. And my personal discomfort with American evangelicalism, all the praise choruses, the audio visuals, the blood atonement theology, and all the rest that goes with those megachurches. That has blocked any effort to modernize our worship services. My own taste in theology, my own preferences in worship have inhibited our making the kinds of changes that were so well embraced at the 5 o'clock Sunday evening underground church services for 4 years. That was wonderful in that setting, not in the sanctuary. Like hem and haw, you and I may have to admit that the biggest inhibitor to change in how we do church lies within ourselves. And then nothing is going to get better until we change. I have no answers to the COVID-19 dilemma, nor for the economic collapse that the mandated shutdowns have caused, nor for the uprisings in the streets over the institutional racism that has been revealed with such callous abandon in the killing of George Floyd and so many other unarmed black men and women of color. But dealing with our own personal resistance to change in a more effective way can be a first baby step along the path of creating a new social norm. A better world is possible, and we can get there. Amen? Amen.